Excited for you to listen to today's episode. We're digging into a medical study, and this is for people. The medical study was based on people with Hashimoto's and the efficacy of the AIP diet. So it's the autoimmune protocol. We actually had Monica Cox on the podcast talking about the autoimmune protocol diet and really how that's important for people with autoimmune disease. So if you have Hashimoto's, or if you have an autoimmune disease, or even if you have thyroid dysfunction, this episode is a must. We dig into the AIP diet, what the study found. There's actually 17 people in the study. One person had to leave the study. The reason she left the study is after 8 weeks, she got pregnant. So it's more than just the diet piece. It is the lifestyle as well. So hopefully you will find some nuggets for you to dig into here. And before you go to the fertility clinic, especially if you have a thyroid dysfunction or Hashimoto's, let's just dig into diet and lifestyle and see how you can really focus on your preconception health and help you get pregnant naturally. Feel free to leave a review on iTunes. I'm excited to announce that our online mindfulness fertility series is starting Thursday, September the 26th. This is a 6-week online program that helps embrace your fertility journey with proven relaxation techniques and stress management strategies that help you regain control and cope with infertility in a much more positive way. Space is very limited, so hop on the wait list to be notified first when registration opens. This program is a must if you have an IUI or an IVF coming up, and it's essential for anyone trying to get pregnant naturally. Go to FabFertile, FABfertile.com, and click on Shop, then Mindfulness Fertility Series to jump on the wait list. That's FabFertile, FABfertile, and click on Shop, and then click on Mindfulness Fertility Series to jump on the wait list. Today's episode is sponsored by Shop AIP, and they are an online grocery store that specializes in anti-inflammatory products. And I have ordered their Snack Attack bundle, which has some awesome snacks. A lot of our couples, they travel a lot, and especially making these diet changes and moving to an autoimmune protocol diet, so AIP diet, can be difficult when you're traveling. So having these little snack items available in your purse or in your bag, so you don't go into that like hangry mode or just kind of running around and then you're eating something that's not going to be making you feel very good and going off the restrictions. And also they have a lot of gluten-free options, dairy-free, really whatever your dietary restriction is, you just enter it in and they're going to give you some awesome options for you to try. And yeah, the stuff is really good. So definitely check them out at Shop AIP. And I have got a 10% discount for you. So you just go into when you go to the checkout, just in the coupon section, in the promo section, you just put Get Pregnant Podcast and you get 10% off. So that's shopaip.com.
Yeah, so the biggest takeaway for me was that a multifaceted, community-based health coaching intervention that also included sort of personalized functional medicine could improve people's quality of life and symptom burden with Hashimoto's thyroiditis. And you could even start to see improvements in thyroid function such that people needed less medication in just as little as 12 weeks.
Welcome to Get Pregnant Naturally, where functional medicine and natural fertility solutions will help you get pregnant and have your baby. Hey everyone, I'm Sarah Clark, and my mission is to inspire, motivate, and empower you. And most of all, I want you to wake up. So with functional medicine, we can discover what causes infertility and eventually reverse the condition. Today, I'm welcoming Dr. Rob Abbott to the podcast, and we're digging into Hashimoto's and the AIP diet, a medical study. Rob Abbott, MD, is the medical director for Resilient Roots, Functional and Evolutionary Medicine in Charlottesville, Virginia. He completed his family medicine internship with VCU-Shenandoah Valley and is a graduate of the University of Virginia School of Medicine. He's completed training with the Institute for Functional Medicine, is a Kresser Institute ADAPT Level 1 clinician, and an AIP Certified Coach. He is currently the medical advisor at Autoimmune Wellness, conducting collaborative research with founders Angie Alt and Mickey Trascott. He approaches medicine from an evolutionary and functional perspective and practices what he calls spiritually focused and evolutionary informed functional medicine. Check out his website at resilientrootsfxmed.com. And before we jump into today's show, don't forget to hit the subscribe button on iTunes or wherever you're listening to this to make sure you never miss an episode. Hey, Dr. Abbott, excited to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, no, excited to be able to talk with you today.
Awesome. Yeah, so if you can share with us how you came to do this work.
I'll say medium-length version of that story. Essentially, I was a medical student with some of my own health challenges and ended up taking some time off from school. And during that time, discovered through podcasts the world of ancestral health and functional medicine. as well as sort of a broader spiritual practice, a yoga practice, and just really discovered holistic health, integrative health, all these sort of buzzwords, but specifically functional medicine and ancestral health. And this was about 7 years ago. And so just completely redirected my life to learn about this sort of informally through blogs and podcasts just like this and other avenues, reading books and things. And when I returned to school, I had this new mindset of how I was going to approach medicine, which made some aspects of school very challenging because it was very different. Other aspects, it was very rewarding. And so I went through medical school at the University of Virginia with a mindset for functional medicine. I went through a family medicine internship. And so sort of a traditional, once again, family medicine background, and then redirected some of my energy and time into my own clinic, which is collaborative with a nutritionist, and put more energy towards research, which I'm sure we'll be getting into some of the research that I've been a part of today. But it's been a creation of my own vision of how to really just live my life and how to practice. And so I'm really happy with how it's turned out. But yeah, it's a little bit about me.
I love that. Yeah, thanks for sharing. I think a lot of people that I find when I ask that question, most people that have come to this field, they've usually gone through their own personal wake-up call and addressed things in their life. And then it's kind of like, oh, once you discover this, it's like, wait a minute, I have to dig further and share it with people.
Yeah, it's an infectious process. It's great to be part of this community and sharing in those stories. I love the narrative. I love stories. It's a really big part of my clinical practice. And without the major challenges that I went through, both with my health and in the medical school sort of traditional environments, coming in with such a different perspective, I don't think I would be here today. And so I'm really happy for some of those challenges to bring about what I think is a wonderful movement.
Lessons learned. And so today we're going to be digging into Hashimoto's and really why that's important. So if someone has so a lot of people come to us, either there's a thyroid dysfunction or they have potentially undiagnosed Hashimoto's, or they know about the Hashimoto's, or they know about the thyroid issues. So why is that important for someone that's trying to conceive? First of all, why would we even care? Because another part of this is people come to me and say, they have an infertility diagnosis and, oh, by the way, I have Hashimoto's.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack there. I think it probably seems pretty obvious to folks. If you're wanting to become pregnant and essentially develop a new organism, develop a baby, thyroid hormone, which runs essentially the metabolic machinery, many growth mechanisms of the body, tied to insulin and other growth mechanisms, we need to have those levels optimal for the development of this baby, this fetus. And so if that is insufficient in some way, there's going to be issues with the development and a continued pregnancy. And so a lot of individuals have issues with miscarriages or even trouble conceiving when they have Hashimoto's thyroiditis or when they have hypothyroidism for another reason. And it's well known and accepted in sort of traditional medicine, mainly from periods of time when, with the development of cretinism or congenital hypothyroidism in fetuses, we start to see the development, poor development of babies early in life when there was inadequate thyroid hormone from the mother. And so we came to sort of understand the critical role for thyroid hormone in this process. And so more research has sort of been put into further trying to understand in the autoimmune process with Hashimoto's, not just specifically sort of with low thyroid or hypothyroidism. Is there something going on here too that is impacting fertility? And I wish I could say we had great answers. It's really, we were just talking just before we started, it's a very evolving field in our understanding of what are the normal ranges for thyroid hormone. Is there an impact for someone if they have TPO antibodies, the main antibody in Hashimoto's for the developing fetus? And we don't really have clear answers yet. The only thing that's starting to really come out now is that the normal range for T4 or the free hormone of T4 in a pregnant woman is much, much tighter and needs to be at a higher level than the normal ranges for the population for adequate development of the fetus. And we're starting to correlate poorer outcomes in terms of early actual preterm birth and other poor outcomes for the baby with inadequate T4. So a lot of effort's been going into starting to pay attention to T4 levels instead of just TSH, which everyone in this community is probably already on board with the realizations and the massive limitations with just TSH, but needing to really understand the T4 levels for conceiving or pregnant women. It's It's a much bigger issue for this population, as we're coming to learn, than just the normal population. And so moving away from simple TSH assays or treating based on TSH. And I guess the last thing I'll sort of say, here is there's a medical diagnosis entity called subclinical hypothyroidism, where essentially someone has abnormal TSH, still a normal, quote, normal T4 level. It's been sort of through many studies and a recent literature review, sort of decided that in most people with subclinical hypothyroidism, thyroid medication is not helpful and not the answer. When it comes to pregnant women, however, back to what I sort of said, you have to monitor the T4. So the rising TSH is probably an early sign that the T4 is probably not ideal and that it needs to be within a tighter range. Young kids and growing kids also is another population where subclinical hypothyroidism may be treated with hormone replacements. But yes, it's a completely different ballgame for conceiving in pregnant women when it comes to thyroid disease. Not that we shouldn't, all of us, be aware and have strict ranges and understanding of the process for everyone. But for pregnant women specifically, it's definitely a bigger issue that I think it needs to be talked about more often.
Absolutely. So the TSH is just the beginning of really looking at that full thyroid panel, looking at the antibodies. And we always ask that when we do a blood chem review, just as an educational thing for people to kind of like, wait a minute, what's been missed here? Especially when they've been told everything is normal and they're trying to conceive and it's not working.
Yeah. I mean, the whole fertility industry and sort of the diagnosis is, you could get me started in a lot of different areas there. I think in traditional medicine, you often get that label and you don't even understand why. And they don't investigate an autoimmune type of thyroid process. They don't investigate actually the man. And it's always assumed it's the woman with issues, whether it's low progesterone, an MTHFR issue, what have you. But a lot of times, in what's kind of sad about the evolution of our species is we're starting to see drastically decreasing sperm counts in men because of a lot of the exogenous environmental toxins and other issues with chronic disease. But I think we have to make sure we have a broader lens and not just like be satisfied with an infertile or fertility issue as a diagnosis that's not really getting at the true root, because that's how you're going to be able to address it from a fundamental level.
Absolutely. Yeah. In the beginning, we were just coaching women and now we're coaching couples, because even though the woman's, it's typically female factor infertility that we're dealing with, but there's always lots of things we can do to, every time we look at the blood chem review or if we do additional testing, there's always things to do to optimize the male partner, and also having everyone on the same page can be really impactful as well.
Yeah. I think, when I'm talking to my interested mothers, I'm always telling them, tell me a year in advance that you're wanting to, conceive. This is a big thing. We need everything to be dialed in. Nutrition seems obvious, but your stress management, your spiritual practice, your connection, these things, like we need to really plan this. And it's not just like, it doesn't just start when you recognize you're pregnant or you have a positive pregnancy test. It needs to be starting 3, 6, 9 months, a year in advance to really optimize that environment. And that includes both the mother and the father.
Absolutely. Yeah. I had Dr. Ben Lynch on the podcast, and he said he was talking to someone who said, why are we taking 12 to 18 months to plan the wedding, and then we want to have the baby within the first month? Why don't we swap that around?
Yes, I know. I love that. Ben does some great work, and
he's awesome
with that statement.
So I had Angie Alt on the podcast a while ago talking about the study that you did with her for the irritable bowel disease and the efficacy of the AIP diet, so the autoimmune protocol diet. And so today we're going to be digging into the AIP diet and Hashimoto's. So what prompted you to do another medical study? And I hear there's more coming.
Yes. So I was quite fortunate to get to meet Angie and sort of her partner at Autoimmune Wellness, Mickey Trescott, a little over 2 years ago at one of the Ancestral Health Symposium conferences. I was a resident at the time, and they were presenting about the AIP IBD study, which I found fascinating because it's really starting to get us into the scientific literature, get some science behind some of the things that we knew in this community were helping people. And I was so excited about it. And so I reached out to them and said, this is my passion. This is what I've been growing. I've been doing training with Chris Kresser. I was doing training with Chris Kresser at the time, and this is my future. And I said, I would love to collaborate with you guys to grow your efforts and maybe bring a medical perspective on things, and would love to do another study. And not really thinking and understanding the whole process and what might be what that might entail. But we sort of started a friendship there, and I started to collaborate and do some writing and research for their blog, all the while sort of designing what I would want to do for a research study. And essentially, I took the same sort of protocol from the AIP IBD study in terms of a single arm. I didn't have a control group, so just one interventional arm, and just modified a little bit Angie's program that was used in that study. So we had this great program, this great framework. And so I just sort of modified elements of that to introduce some more personalized functional medicine care that I could deliver to the study participants, and then change the specific markers that we were going to be using to study for the thyroid population, which the primary objective markers that we were looking at were quality of life and symptom burden, which if there's someone with Hashimoto's listening, they're probably like, yeah, that's a huge issue. There's a myriad of symptoms that have been attributed to Hashimoto's in sort of a non-specific way. And it's a very chronic, relapsing, remitting disease. And people's quality of life is severely impacted. And so we really wanted to study foundationally as a primary outcome, could we improve people's quality of life? Could we decrease their symptom burdens? You could argue that that's sort of like a subjective marker. Yes, it's subjective based off the person, but we try to use questionnaires as an objectification of that subjective experience. And at the end of the day, like, I only really care what the person experiences, whether it's someone else outside of the a physician, or myself looks from an objective outside perspective and says, well, that's not necessarily the case. I want to know how the person is feeling. And we also looked at some other blood markers. We looked at thyroid function, and we looked at thyroid antibodies. So the TPO antibody was the main one, and we also looked at antithyroid globulin antibody. It had some inflammatory immune markers. So I looked at aspects of the CBC, a complete blood cell count. I looked at their white blood cells, and looked at also something called high sensitivity C-reactive protein, which is a sort of non-specific inflammatory marker, to see if we could see any kind of modulation in this group. And overall, because of study funding limitations, which interestingly enough, we raised all the money ourselves through crowdfunding. This community is just, it's so awesome. This community sort of got behind us, and bare bones just to cover the labs and things. We needed about $12,000, and we raised it in less than 3 weeks, and which was just phenomenal. But because of those still relatively pretty small budget, we could only enroll sort of a certain number of folks, and we could only do labs at 2 time points. So the overall study was only 12 weeks, which was certainly, I think, short, especially when you think about the time course of thyroid disease and seeing changes in certain markers. But the intervention itself was a 12-week intervention with a 6-week core phase of eliminations based off Angie's SAD to AIP and 6 health coaching program, and then a 4-week period of maintenance, and then a couple weeks built in there for doing lab testing and what have you. So overall, pretty short study. We just had a single arm of individuals with Hashimoto's thyroiditis between the ages of 20 and 45. And they were also normal weight or just overweight. So we didn't have anyone who was obese. I was worried about weight loss and needing to need less thyroid medication very quickly. And since I was working with folks from remotely through the study across the country, I didn't want to, and I wasn't prescribing their medication, I didn't want to have that liability. So we had a somewhat narrow population, but I thought it was pretty representative of the primary group that's affected. Women specifically, and sort of middle-aged women are disproportionately affected with Hashimoto. So even though our sample size was kind of small and had some restrictions on age, I think it was still fairly representative of the main population that is affected. And those are, the main nuts and bolts of the markers we looked at, who we included, the sort of study design, and happy to sort of elaborate on anything from there if you had any sort of specific questions.
Yeah, sure. And so you also included food journals, stool testing, and then you looked at the antibodies. Those are measured as well then?
Yes. So we looked at through blood, we looked at the thyroid antibodies. We also were very fortunate to get some specialized sort of functional medicine testing through Genova Diagnostics. They donated comprehensive stool analyses and their organic acid test, which they call a NutriVal, which also had some toxic elements and nutrient markers on there as well. So we had those donated. The original study I didn't design for those things to be primary markers, so it was sort of used for research purposes. But we did use those tests at the beginning and the end to sort of inform some nutritional recommendations. There was no drug therapy, there was no supplement therapy, any fancy protocols. It was all food-based and nutrition-based, but we still used those tests to identify certain nutrient concerns such as B6 or B12 or folates, magnesium, zinc, or if they had a heavy metal burden, lead, mercury, arsenic, what have you. we used that information in the beginning to help sort of inform what we could do from a nutritional standpoint and what Angie and the other health coach nutritionist could do from her standpoint with the folks in the group.
And so as far as the results, let's what were the findings regarding the thyroid medication? Just talk about some of the findings if you could, please.
Yeah, so we had 17 women begin this study. 16 women finished. The only woman who didn't finish actually was having some infertility issues when she began the study and became pregnant by week 8, week 9, which was awesome. So I was like, if we have to, this is the person we have to kick out for becoming pregnant. I mean, that's a good problem to have. So she was really, really happy, and just further proof of, hey, this dietary approach, eliminating some key foods and including other nutrient-dense foods, is promoting of fertility in a hypothyroid population. So that was just a wonderful case example. Of the 16 women who finished, 13 of them started the study on some form of replacement medication that could have been just normal T4, something like levothyroxine or Synthroid, or could have been a combination of T4 or T3, something like Armour or Nature-Throid, one of those medicines. But they were on some form of replacement. And of those 13, 6 of them were able to decrease their medication at least once. A couple of them actually decreased the medication twice throughout the 12-week study. So almost half of the participants needed less medication by the end of the study. A 7th woman also transitioned to a T4 only medication at the end. She started with a T4, T3 combination at the beginning. I debated about including her in the statistics since she technically wasn't taking the T3 anymore, but I, in the end, didn't put her formally in the paper. But yeah, so about 50% of the people needed less medication just after 12 weeks from this multifaceted lifestyle intervention, which was phenomenal. And while we didn't see any changes in TSH at the group level, mainly because we started at a pretty ideal TSH around 2, and it was around 2 at the end. And we didn't see any changes with antibodies. Once again, I wasn't sure what the starting antibody level was going to be before TPO antibody was going to be before I enrolled the folks. They just had to have some antibody level in the past that was elevated. And so the starting antibody level for TPO was just above 200, which for me clinically is actually like, I see folks all the time like 700, 800, and we're trying to get them down to 200, 300. So it was actually starting relatively low. So it was going to be pretty hard to see a change in such a short period of time. So yeah, we didn't see changes in those markers statistically from beginning to end. But when you look at those decreases in medication and then the other outcomes being quality of life and symptom burden, which dramatically improved. I mean, it was phenomenal to see some people with a symptom burden score in the 80s and 90s. And this is like golf. You don't want a high score in the 80s and 90s, and then afterwards having a score of like 6 or 10. I mean, just radical changes. And there's that massive change in clinical symptom burden and major improvements in quality of life across multiple domains: physical health, emotional health, pain scores, vitality, or energy, general health. I mean, it was just it was amazing to see these radical shifts in their overall well-being, and decreases in symptoms, and even seeing some corollary changes in thyroid function such that majority of the folks needed less medication by the end of the study. So those are some of the major, really wonderful findings of the intervention. And there's a couple others I could certainly get into, but would love your thoughts and reflections on the first ones.
Yeah. So, and I guess also so you talk about the quality of life, and so I was reading the study talking about people had improvements with skin, with hay fever, with sinus complaints, all of those specific things. I don't think people would, because I think a lot of times people in the conventional side think that for hay fever or seasonal allergies that it's you're stuck taking Claritin for the rest of your life, and that's just not the case. And same with skin, with acne or sinus issues. These are all things that I experienced having been diagnosed with POF at 28, had both my kids with donor eggs, and then my health took a nosedive. And so all of these things I had then hypothyroidism. So the improvements with that, can you talk a little bit about that for us?
Yes. So the symptom questionnaire that we used for the study is called something called the Medical Symptoms Questionnaire, developed by Jeffrey Bland through the Institute for Functional Medicine. And it's a multifaceted symptom questionnaire that breaks things down into different sort of systems or organ groups so you can better objectify what specific symptoms someone is having. And so while you can get an overall objective score, and that was used in the study, I looked at each of the subscales and looked at the individual symptoms for each patient, developing the case studies for the paper to see what areas were actually improving from individual to individual. And so that was what in the case studies we started to see, that folks were reporting improvements in joint pain, improvements in skin rashes, improvements in sleep, improvements in allergy symptoms. I mean, multiple things that you wouldn't necessarily think were directly related to, say, the Hashimoto's process. And a lot of things, aren't. We have this diagnosis of Hashimoto's thyroiditis for everyone participating, but we know this co-occurs. Almost all autoimmune disease co-occurs with some underlying gut disruption, which is then going to impact your skin. It's going to impact your cognition. It's going to impact other, metabolic systems. So from a functional medicine perspective, it makes total sense how all these things interrelate and can improve when you use a foundational treatment and multi-layered treatment from a lifestyle domain standpoint. But when you look from a traditional perspective, everything's so isolated. Like you said, it's like, oh, you're going to be resigned to an antihistamine, Claritin, for the rest of your life. And to see some of those improvements, I think that was also, from a symptom standpoint, why people's quality of life improves so dramatically. You improve joint pain, you're able to move, you're able to increase your energy, sleep improves, you have more energy, you're able to do more with your family. All these things are sort of interrelated. And it just, while I've seen some of that in my own work clinically and working with Angie independently of the study, it was just so wonderful to be able to see that come out objectively in the markers that we were looking at and seeing the work that these women were doing and talking to them. It was really wonderful.
Absolutely. I love that. Yeah. And also with reducing the thyroid medication, and then you had them consume more folate. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So basically, everyone did labs in the beginning of the study to get a baseline TSH, T4, T3 levels. We did a comprehensive panel for folks, and then we repeated that at the end. And so I used the TSH marker specifically, as well as someone's symptoms, such as, say, they were starting to get anxiety, nervousness, jitteriness, restlessness, loose stools, symptoms we might consider in a over-medicated or hyperthyroid states. I used the combination of their labs and their clinical presentation to determine if they were on too much medication and if they needed to decrease. The organic acid test, the NutrEval test that we used from Genova Diagnostics is extremely comprehensive. I mean, even with the years I've studied it and used it clinically, I always feel like there's still something that I know there's things in that test and I'm not putting into clinical practice. But on that test, some of the markers that are examined to look at some of the the status of various B vitamins include markers such as methylmalonic acid. If folks are familiar, that is a sort of intermediate marker that I give people the analogy of think about kids getting out of school and needing to cross the street, and they require a crossing guard to get across the street. So you can imagine, bell goes off, school gets out, all the kids line up on one side of the street. If you only have one crossing guard, you're going to get a big buildup of kids on that side of the street. If you have plenty of crossing guards, you get them across and you don't get a buildup on that side of the street. So what we can do from a biochemical standpoint is we can look at pathways that require crossing guards, which can also be considered a cofactor for a enzyme, but look for a process like that requires a crossing guard. And if you start to see a buildup of those kids on one side of the street, you can infer that there's not enough crossing guards. So in the case of B12 is a cofactor for various reactions. It's a crossing guard. So if it's not around, you start to build up you can build up a lot of these kids. And methylmalonic acid, in this sort of analogy, would be kids getting let out from school. And so when you see an elevated methylmalonic acid or elevated amount of kids on one side of the street, you infer and you can deduce that there's a B12 deficiency. So it's different than, say, measuring a serum B12 level, which can be sort of falsely normal because there's a very wide range and isn't really telling you what's happening at the cellular level. So this organic acid test takes it another step further to look at those crossing guards. Like that example with methylmalonic acid is one for detecting B12 deficiency. Something called FIGLU is another marker that's used for folate. Same analogy. It's you can think of that as the students on one side of the street building up where folate would be the crossing guard. So if you don't have enough folate, you build up FIGLU. High FIGLU equals folate deficiency. And these tests are much more sensitive for detecting functional deficiencies than a serum B12 folate test, which everyone's probably accustomed to getting. And I rarely see those things abnormal unless someone's been a vegan, not eating animal protein for like years, and they have no B12, or alcoholics who have a terrible diet and can become folate deficient. Those are like the only extreme scenarios I'm ever really seeing frank folate B12 deficiency based off the basic lab. But just in our study population, we saw folks that had issues with elevated FIGLU, so folate issues with folate. We saw elevated methylmalonic acid, so issues with B12. There's other markers. I don't want to get it too complex for folks, but other markers for B6 metabolism, if elevated, points to B6 issues. So we could identify some of these markers in the beginning, as well as looking at red blood cell values of magnesium, zinc, serum copper, serum, other minerals to look at status there. But those key sort of B vitamins, we were able to identify from a functional level if they were deficient in the beginning, and then encourage them to start including foods that were more rich in those foods. Once again, reiterating, we had no supplements, we had no drugs at our disposal for the study intervention. So we encouraged them to start including AIP compliant foods rich in those vitamins, in regards of folate, dark leafy greens, and liver organ meats is like nature's multivitamin. And so we're really pushing for folks to increase the amount of liver that we're eating to get folate. And I will point out, of the nutrient markers that we saw sort of fluctuate in the study, we did see that there was a trend towards more people having issues with needing more folate at the end of the study. And I think that's because some of the foods eliminated on AIP, the grains, the fortified, refined grains that have folic acid, have folate in some sort of form in them, were being removed. Even legumes, some other high sources of folate were being removed. And it's really, really hard to just eat enough leafy greens just because of the bulky nature of them to really get enough adequate folate. And so if someone wasn't including liver in their diet, having removed other sources of folate, they were going to start to have issues. And from a utilization standpoint, if they were consuming other foods and other pathways are getting online, they could potentially develop a functional issue with a relative folate deficiency. So that was actually one of the cautions that I gave in a post on autoimmune wellness after the study, that we need to be aware from this study that folate status could be compromised when you're following an autoimmune protocol diet if you do not include those organ meats, which are very rich sources of multiple nutrients, but the folate and really adequate amounts of dark leafy greens. And this is not an opinion of mine. This is straight fact from the organic acid tests. Almost all the other nutrients that we saw dramatic improvements in folks. So started with B6 issues and ended without a B6 issue. Started with a B12 issue, saw that resolve by the end of the study. So the nutritional interventions that we gave folks halfway through based on the test were very effective. But I wasn't an MG as a health coach. It was hard. And this came out at the end when I was talking to people. It was hard to get them to start eating organ meats. And it's still a challenge that I face in my practice. And we've been able to find one kind of solution around us locally. We've been super blessed in my clinic to have a butcher near us who sources some great, grass-fed, grass-finished beef, and they also get organ meats from the local farmers, and they do a custom grind. So they combine the ground beef and the liver to turn it into basically a ground beef. I call it ground liver mixture. That it's really hard to tell that it's liver. Mickey also has a wonderful liver pate recipe on her website that I would direct people to. But trying to practically give people advice on how to incorporate these organ meats, because eating liver in and of itself it's got a very funky taste. So we've been lucky to have that butcher, and we've been encouraging folks, and it's becoming like they know who we are now. We have like a custom grind for our patients to go get that combination, so they can start eating the organ meats to get that folate, to get the copper, to get the iron, some of the other really critical nutrients for thyroid health, but also for conceiving and pregnant women.
Nice. And obviously anyone trying to conceive, taking a prenatal that has methylated folate. We had Dr. Ben Lynch talking all about this because a lot of people are taking folic acid, which is not recommended. And so taking folate, but in this case, no one was supplementing. So you had to make sure with AIP diet that they needed that liver and the leafy greens because they weren't necessarily getting that in the supplement.
Yes. And I'll encourage folks. I love Ben's work, and he has his own supplements brand, Seeking Health. So obviously from a business standpoint, and he has some good products, don't get me wrong. I think he's doing great work. Prenatal is certainly one that I've had folks take and can encourage to take. But I also tell people, if you think about it, we discount what we get through our diet, and everyone's experience is different. I think the study showed in that one case for the one woman who was having infertility issues, like diet has a huge impact. So don't discount the nutrition that we get from our diet and think that simply taking the prenatal and folate, I think, gets all the concern and hype because of the associations with various neural tube defects and what have you. But I think sometimes we miss the boat on, thinking we take the multivitamin, we cover our bases, and not giving enough credence to like how we can actually meet all those needs and through our diets. And we've actually, in working with some pregnant women, really try to minimize the use of prenatals, if at all possible. Yes, if we develop, food aversions and some, issues with nausea and food intake becomes an issue, but not discounting the incredible impact the diet can be, and also all the other things that we're doing for back to the preconception environment, but stress management, movement, all the other things that are creating an optimal environment for the developing fetus. I want to emphasize and we try to empower women and couples to see all the other things that they're doing and not feel like they're a good or bad person because they take a prenatal. That's just one teeny tiny piece of the puzzle, which probably in a lot of folks who are doing all these other things right is probably not really doing much for them. But that's also, it may be a little controversial, and that's just my opinion from working with folks and seeing some of this nutritional data in patients and from the study. But yeah, I say all that just to so people can realize and feel empowered with all the things that they're doing positively for the developing fetus.
To really find a good butcher that has grass-fed liver and beef and make some pate is what you're saying.
Yes, get a custom grind. We've worked with some folks virtually, and so we've been trying to sort of build a network of finding folks with our virtual patients to get that. And even folks that are traveling a couple hours, we're like, bring your cooler, get an order before you come. Get it frozen, take it home in the poundfuls and freeze it, because it's been a game changer for us clinically. And so it's my biggest piece of practical advice for folks listening. If you can find somebody locally, a butcher who can source the right meats and give you that custom grind. Ryan, my partner, jokes, he's got a 6, almost 7-year-old daughter, and she has no idea. She thinks it's ground beef. She has no idea that there's liver in it. She's getting great, nature's multivitamins. So yeah, it's a great way to be able to incorporate this really nutrient dense food without the ick that people think about from normal liver.
Mm-hmm. And so the woman that did get pregnant, can you talk a little bit about her case? And it's detailed in the study, but what some takeaways from her for obviously our listeners are keen to know more there.
Yeah. So she, started the study actually fairly, of all the people who started, I think she had a fairly minimal symptom burden, which we had folks, I would say from my experience clinically and from other functional practitioners, based on the MSQ and the SF-36, that quality of life questionnaire, we had folks who were, were struggling pretty hard at the beginning. And so compared to that, she was actually doing relatively well in terms of her quality of life and functioning, but was struggling with, infertility, and yes, did have Hashimoto's, and had some elevated antibody levels, not hugely elevated. They were just sort of slightly elevated. A lot of her coaching and approach was really encouraging the nutritional aspects of the lifestyle intervention from a nutrient density standpoint. So really starting to include foods like I've been mentioning, the organ meats, the omega-3s from fatty fish, vitamin A from the organ meats, but even, the carotenoids to some extent. So really encouraging the incorporation of the nutrient dense foods, even more so than, say, the eliminations of some of the inflammatory foods, but really promoting the inclusion of those nutrient-dense foods. And then and looking at her thyroid function in the beginning, I wanted to ensure that, yes, from everything I talked about earlier, that she had enough T4. TSH was not sufficient for me. I wanted to make sure she was based off these specialized pregnancy ranges and the higher normal range for T4. So knowing she had an optimal amount for if she did become pregnant for the developing fetus. So I checked those in the beginning, which she was fine. So she didn't need to modify her medication dose. And then when we talked at the 6-week point through the organic acid testing, once again, just sort of filling in some of the gaps, she actually had fairly ideal nutrient markers. She wasn't majorly deficient in other areas. And so we just sort of gave some specific tweaks and recommendations from the NutriVal test that wanting to shore up some of the B vitamins and just further promote optimal omega-3 status in her cells. And then it was around week 8, week 9, when she sent a message that she had a positive pregnancy test. So if you actually put things back in terms of conception, it was actually sort of somewhere in the middle of the study where she conceived and then found out weeks later with the missed period in the pregnancy test. So it even tells you that it only took really a few weeks into the study to sort of include some of those foods that she actually saw the shift and was able to get pregnant. So.
And was she taking a T4 only, or what was she taking for medication?
Yes, she was on a T4 only medication. But yeah, it was, the whole study was, back to what I was saying earlier with the people who were able to decrease medication, of the three women who finished and who started the study not on medication. So they had elevated antibodies, but they weren't taking replacements. So they weren't frank hypothyroid in need of supplementation yet. The 3 women, they did not need to start medication by the end. There was one woman who I'm guessing she was just beginning to get diagnosed and was seeing an increase in her TSH. I'm guessing in the near future she was going to go on medication, but by the end of the study, she did not start medication use. So, all in all, when you look at it's a small group. When you look at the group, I was impressed to see the major changes in needing less medication in such a short period of time, and the other people who weren't on medication in the beginning, not needing it after the study intervention.
And so what's your take on a phased-in approach to AIP?
I think it is critical. I work with folks in my clinic who come in super motivated, and I can count on my hand, I think, a few fingers, the number of people who can overnight cold turkey follow AIP. It's really hard to do. You eliminate some nutrient-dense foods, some quote good foods. It's very hard to do. And Angie's program, the SAD to AIP and 6 program, breaking it down into phases and then having the community elements, I think was the main reason we saw such great adherence by the group. There's great accountability. They had the support from the medical team. I can't because of the multiple variables, we can't really say what impacted folks' health positively, but I really believe that the community aspect, to give that degree of accountability and doing it in phases, made it doable for people in a very practical way. And I definitely can't discount that, and that's why I encourage folks and continue to have a direct relationship with Angie, because her program, which she's curated over I think about 6-7 years now, is a game changer from simply getting a list of foods, even a recipe book, and trying to do it on your own, or even working with a health coach. It can still be challenging, and trying to implement things overnight is probably only right for a small subset of people. So yeah, I love the phased elimination approach.
And so doing elimination diet and then kind of phasing in some of the nightshades and the other stuff. So doing it in stages. Yeah,
basically eliminating the foods in the beginning that are really the most likely giving you problems. Things like the grains need to go first, alcohol need to go first, and then towards the end, saving the things that are more nutrient dense and less likely to cause you problems, and eliminating those towards the end. So, like nuts and seeds, very nutrient dense. It's hard to say who's going to have issues with them from the beginning. Saving those eliminations towards the end. And then while we didn't do reintroductions in this study, it was all maintenance of elimination for the subsequent 4 weeks. The reintroduction phase is based on the same idea, introducing the foods that have the greatest nutrient density and are least likely to cause you issues in the beginning. And that is still constantly evolving. I mean, a lot of that's based on basic science, because we haven't done clinical research on the reintroduction period to look at, say objective markers to see what should be the things included first. And it's a very personalized process, but there are some basic guidelines on trying to eliminate or trying to reintroduce certain foods first based on the nutrient density and likelihood of them causing issues for the individual.
And then why is it more than just the AIP? I think a lot of people will get, wait, I've gone gluten-free, dairy-free. Maybe I've started to do the AIP. But then I haven't dug into the mental emotional side of these things, environmental toxins, obviously gut infections, things like that. But why is it more than just AIP?
I think that's sort of like, there's many ways to, answer that. And it's how we designed the study. We know while nutrition is a huge piece, it's never the only piece. And there's great associations, very rigorous research with associations of stress, post-traumatic stress disorder, and development of autoimmune conditions, and in certain disease states, seeing increased flares and inability and relapses and inability to get into remission based off of environmental stresses. And so, stress management, improved sleep, all these other things that it's easy sometimes to just give lip service to. We made a very critical we made them to be a critical piece of the program, and which Angie has included that in the nature of her health coaching. So it's not just emphasizing the diet piece, because you can do that 100% perfectly and still not make improvements, because the other domains are your weaker areas, say insufficient sleep or very high stress job and what have you. So we have to emphasize those other areas. And that's why the group and the dynamics of the health team working with folks, we emphasize those areas, because we knew we were going to see gains, and more gains if we incorporated those other elements and not just the diet. And it's certainly something that I want to study further in future research, is actually starting to tease out the impact of the community element, the health coaching element, versus say just the diet. And so hopefully in late 2020, we'll be able to do a larger study with Hashimoto's individuals and at this point, I'm hoping to do 3 arms. One arm essentially just being on a wait list and not doing anything. A second arm just getting the diet, and then a third arm getting the same program. So the community and the health coaching, trying to once again sort of tease out what role is the community playing, what role is the diet playing, and what have you. Because I think while some folks in the science world feel like studies like this that have so many variables don't like it because you can't control for things, we as clinicians know all these things work. And so once we sort of have a proof of concept study like this, you can then go forward and start to tease out what role, say, is community playing, and actually start to bolster what we should be doing clinically, why we should be including health coaches more often, what types of interventions should we include if we start to see that other elements outside of the nutritional piece are actually the main drivers of improvement. So I see it as a very positive thing, and what's going to drive my clinical research going forward.
And so the biggest takeaway from the study, what was that?
Yeah, so the biggest takeaway for me was that a multifaceted, community-based health coaching intervention that also included sort of personalized functional medicine could improve people's quality of life and symptom burden with Hashimoto's thyroiditis. And you could even start to see improvements in thyroid function such that people needed less medication in just as little as 12 weeks. So from that, I see that I'm going to, from my clinical perspective, see the value of the autoimmune protocol diet for folks with Hashimoto's. But beyond that, also see the role of health coaching, the role of community-based health coaching and phase eliminations. All of those things I see are going to be critical, and I want to use this study to inform how I should practice my own practice and how other clinicians should practice. It's also going to inform, as I was getting to earlier, what are we going to study next in a future study? How are we going to start to tease out these elements? And so for folks listening, hopefully they can hear that, yes, a multifaceted intervention that has multiple elements, not just a diet intervention, but multiple elements with health coaching and personalized functional medicine can help people improve their life rather quickly. I would say 12 weeks is a rather short time, especially when you think about the duration of most people's chronic illnesses. So I don't know, I would say that's the main takeaway and the main sort of looking forward, where are we going to go from here?
Yeah, and that woman that was able to get pregnant, hers wasn't as bad, but then being able to make these changes and actually get pregnant instead of going to the fertility clinic and then looking at a postpartum period and healthier children. So to me, all that working on your preconception health is vital. And then what about criticisms of the study?
Yeah, so I've sort of been pointing out some of the things that are probably fairly obvious to some folks. It was a small study. We had 17 people started, 16 finished. So yes, an underpowered study for the markers we were looking at. We looked at technically subjective markers, so quality of life and symptom burden being subjective variable questionnaires, those being very reasonable critiques. We didn't have a control group. It was just a pilot intervention. So we just had one experimental arm. So we can control for the, with a group that wasn't getting anything, so trying to control for an expectancy or placebo effect. Those are the main sort of criticisms that we already knew when we designed the study. And the thing that I tell folks is that it was a rough draft and there's no research that's been done in this domain. So this is a natural progression. You have to do a small study first to try to see, can you actually do this? Is this the right process? Are you looking at the right measures? And then that can help you inform larger studies, because this stuff costs a lot of money, especially if we're going to be doing crowdfunding. I do not want to waste anyone's money off the get-go saying, yeah, let's do a study of 150 people. And then it was poorly designed. We couldn't execute it. And regardless of what the results were, it just was, poorly done. We have to do things in stages. And while it will take time to accumulate evidence on a larger scale, I'm really happy with this sort of first intervention, this first study, and also just so excited with how the community banded together to make it happen in less than a year, which is like light speed for research. If anyone's familiar with the research process, the whole process from design, approval, funding, implementation, write-up, peer review and publication was less than a year, which, it just blows me away. So there's so much encouragement from this process that, the little small criticisms are just inherent to the normal scientific process.
Mm-hmm. And then just some recommendations from you. Is there a book or a website or an app or a documentary, anything that you're currently obsessed with, potentially related to our topic today, or what you're digging right now?
Man, it's funny. I used to, back to the beginning of my story, I used to listen to podcasts nonstop, and I kept notebooks, and it was, I was listening to 8 hours of podcasts a day. It was it was like medical school, my own. I've sort of curved back from that at this point, but I would certainly point people to, the biggest folks that have had an influence in my life and who are continuing to do very rigorous work. So Autoimmune Wellness, the home of Mickey Trescott, Angie Ott, I continue to write for them on sort of medical topics. I just wrote an article about medical cannabis and autoimmune disease. But they have some great articles on the site, recipes and things for folks with autoimmune disease. I would really encourage folks to follow them, and we're continuing to do, there's more research already in the works right now through that community. So follow them. Chris Kresser has been a huge influence in my life, both early on, and I've done his practitioner training. He continues to train practitioners and is now training health coaches. And he just has great, very vigorous content on his website, blogs, podcasts, very accessible content. And I think his heart is really in this movement. So really encourage folks to follow his work. Those have been some of the biggest influences in my life. I know Dr. Michael Ruscio is also another very close friend of mine, and someone who's doing some, I think, very rigorous evidence-based work looking at thyroid and gut health, which we've been talking a little bit about today, but just doing a great job of synthesizing the literature and making it accessible to a lay audience. So those really have been to me, the most impactful people in my life who are doing and continuing to do great work.
Excellent. So the Autoimmune Wellness, Chris Kresser, and Dr. Michael Ruscio, which I follow all of those.
Yes.
And is there a success story you'd like to share? Obviously, you've just shared a huge success story, but anything else that comes to mind that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yeah. So someone from the study?
Or anything in general that maybe relate to pregnancy or from the study, or anything you'd like to share?
Yeah. Well, I guess, it's a good question. So I do have an individual who I've been working with for, I guess, not quite a year, who came in with a previous issue, issues of PCOS, and had done a lot of work with Angie actually specifically with making autoimmune changes of following AIP, and then starting to do some reintroductions, and been working with her. It was actually, she was really not thinking that pregnancy was going to be something that was going to happen in the near future. And it took I think two months for her to get pregnant. And she's in the, I think, second trimester of her pregnancy and doing great. We're able to, she had some, thyroid and some gut issues that we were able to work through to optimize there, and some other nutrient concerns. And it was just, I think, a wonderful example, once again, of putting energy into multiple domains. It wasn't just diet, but from a functional perspective, and being able to sort of overcome some initial diagnoses, in the past, and PCOS and some issues with blood sugar and things, and to basically reverse that and to get pregnant with it. It surprised her. It surprised all of us. So that's been, I think, a wonderful story within my practice, and also sort of collaboratively working with Angie.
Mm-hmm. Love that. And you have a health education ebook for people. And what can they expect in that book?
Yeah. So it is I sort of alluded to it earlier when I was saying I used to listen to hours and hours of podcasts. So I am going through and trying to educate myself through medical school on the side. I came across multiple resources, and I felt I would love if there was a one-stop shop guide that could sort of point out where to go, and laid it out also in different cognitive learning styles. So some people are very auditory and listen to podcasts. Some people want to read it. They want blogs. Other people want to go to conferences, in-person trainings, online trainings, videos. And so I've made, the first one came out in 2017. The current version I updated last year and is on the webpage. And so I just basically put together a catalog of hundreds of podcast blogs with short descriptions for some of them. Other ones are just, lists and links, but the links are embedded in the podcast or in the ebook. So you can start to grow your education. It can be a little bit overwhelming. So like people go to that, I need to be doing all of this. No, that's not the point. It's supposed to be a little bit, it's not exhaustive, but to give you a bigger glimpse of some of the folks in this space. So you can find out about someone new, and you find a new podcast, find a book to read, find a blog to follow. So that's the main purpose of the ebook, and what you'll find when you get it, when you download it.
And I'll have the link in the show notes, but you can find it at abmedicalmind.com/health-e-book.html. The link will be in the show notes. And I feel like I found this a couple years ago where you were on the Evolutionary Medicine podcast with James Maskell.
Yes.
Yeah. And I remember finding this, and this ebook is awesome. It has got so many resources in there. And I was like, that's how I found Dr. Michael Ruscio. And yeah, so it's definitely check that out.
Yeah. I'll make sure, if you don't have I know that would have been the original one. James Maskell is I was so lucky to be able to that was sort of my coming out into the space to share that. I was a student at the time. So I'm glad you were able to find that. I'll make sure you have if you don't already have the updated version with, it's some similarities, but even more things on there. But yeah, folks definitely, get it. And I'm always, if people email me too, and you find something else that I should include, I will probably update it again next year. I know I've been super busy this year, but want to update it next year to keep adding to a catalog of great resources. So
amazing. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast, sharing your words of wisdom on this topic, digging into this study. We're going to link the study in the show notes as well. And I just think this is, to me, if you're struggling with infertility, and if you're listening to this podcast, to look into this study. And if you're dealing with Hashimoto's or thyroid issues, like this stuff is life changing. And I'm so excited to have you on and to really share this information. And thanks again.
No, thank you. For having me and for doing the work that you're doing. It takes a community, it takes a village, it takes all of us doing, our individual work. And so I truly do appreciate the work that you're doing and the opportunity to share some of the work and things that I'm up to. So yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Excited to have Shop AIP as the sponsor for this episode. And you can get a 10% discount when you go to shopaip.com. And at checkout, just enter in the coupon code GetPregnantPodcast, and you can start with the AIP diet right away. So that's shopaip.com and enter in Get Pregnant Podcast at the checkout. Hey there, I regularly speak with 5 to 10 couples per week who are struggling to have their baby. And although we want to help everyone, we only have 2 spots available per month to work with us. So the Supercharge Your Fertility Discovery Call is for action takers and really people who are ready to move forward so they can finally have their baby. And if you're not ready and you wait, the risk is you'll need to wait 2 to 3 months for a spot to open up. So if you're seriously considering working with us, go to FabFertile, FABfertile.com, and click on Book a Free Call. Then you'll be all booked in and ready to spend 30 minutes to give you the action plan to getting pregnant naturally. That's FabFertile, FABfertile.com, and click on Book a Free Call. The Get Pregnant Naturally podcast, including show notes and links, provides information with respect to healthy living, nutrition, lab testing, and is intended for informational purposes only. The information provided is not a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment, nor is it to be construed as such. We cannot guarantee that the information provided on the Get Pregnant Naturally podcast reflects the most up-to-date medical research. Information is provided without representation or warranties of any kind. Please consult a qualified physician for medical advice and always seek the advice of a qualified healthcare provider with any questions you may have regarding your health and nutrition program.